address risks, human rights risks in global supply chains, according to OECD due diligence guidance. And you can also see that there are 4 different typical core activities that the ETI organizations is doing. We're raising competence, giving guidance, and providing tools, methods, and also doing hands-on projects. And what is typical for ETI is, of course, that is cross-sectoral, that it's a multi-stakeholder initiative where everyone works jointly together towards the same goal. Next slide, please. And today is also a historic day because I have the pleasure to introduce to you ETI Sweden's new director, Henrik Lindholm. So I would like to give you a hand. You can do that, but please be muted. But Henrik, if you can unmute and just say hello. Are you there?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the introduction.
And you will take over now and introduce our first speaker, right?
Yes. We'll start with Owain Johnstone from ETI UK, where he's the modern slavery advisor. And he also has a PhD from University of Oxford on human trafficking, if I'm correctly informed. So I'll give Owain Johnstone the floor to start his presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Henrik. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can I check if you can all see that now?
It works for me.
Perfect. Thank you. And apologies that I was a few minutes late this morning. So thank you very much for having me on this call this morning. It's a real pleasure to join. As Henrik has said, my name's Owain. I'm from ETI UK. Actually, I was modern slavery advisor up until about a month ago, and just recently I've now become policy advisor, which is a change of emphasis, but the sort of modern slavery parts of what ETI UK does still fall within my remit. So what I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so is I'm just going to give a little bit of background to ETI's work, ETI UK's work on modern slavery and on migrant workers over the last few years. And then I'm going to describe 2 pieces of work we're currently doing which are more immediately relevant to the COVID-19 situation, to give you a bit of an idea of what we're currently engaged with. As some of you may be familiar with some of what I'm describing, and I won't go into anything in too much detail, but please do feel free to ask further questions about any of this, and I'm happy to expand as useful. So a sort of whistle-stop tour through the past few years of these 2 areas for ETI UK. I joined ETI UK, by the way, in early 2018, so just over 2 years ago. And that was just a couple of months after we had established a dedicated modern slavery strategy unit headed up by Cindy Berman, who's now left ETI. And the formation of that team at the end of 2017 was a recognition that the debate around modern slavery in the UK had sort of gained such momentum and importance that although we had previously been doing work in relation to it, we needed to be doing a sort of more organizing a dedicated program of work specifically under that heading. And a lot of that work was orientated towards the UK's Modern Slavery Act, which was introduced in 2015. The Act in some ways was very important, and in other ways wasn't that new. It was very important in that it was the first national level modern slavery legislation in the world, and it brought a lot of attention to the issue in the UK. At the same time, it didn't introduce any new criminal offences. It brought together a series of offences that had already existed in previous legislation, offences of human trafficking and slavery, forced labour, and servitude. So it wasn't new in that sense. But from our point of view, the important piece, as you'll know, was the very new obligation on companies to report on what they were doing to address modern slavery and human trafficking risks in their operations and supply chains. And ETI UK was involved in lobbying for the introduction of that clause in 2014. So although the behaviours that are usually described as modern slavery, forced labour, human trafficking, slavery, clearly relate to ETI's core work, and in a sense have been part of our work since our foundation.
Excuse me, Owain.
Yeah.
I think that what's on your screen is actually not what the rest of them see. So,
I'm very sorry. Okay.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I have your presentation. So please just let me know where we should be in the presentation, because now it's the first slide.
Perfect. My apologies, I didn't realize you had control. Please could you move to slide number 2? That's it. Great. Thank you.
So can you see now that it changed?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
Okay.
perfect.
So just let me know when you need the next slide.
Okay. I will do.
Thank you.
So as I was saying, the behaviours described by modern slavery have been part of what ETI has worked to address for more than 20 years. Predominantly, you'll be familiar, I imagine, with ETI's base code of 9 labour standards derived from the core ILO conventions, and base code clause 1, which is forced labour, and base code clause 4, which is child labour, largely cover the kind of behaviours we talk about when we talk about modern slavery. But the supply chain reporting component, which was introduced in the 2015 legislation, was very new. And so ETI has done quite a bit of work over the past 4 years in relation to that to try to strengthen its enforcement and its implementation. Partly that's involved doing research into how business received that piece of legislation and what impact it had. And partly, for example, we created a tool to help businesses write better modern slavery statements, and to help those who might want to evaluate a statement understand how to identify strengths and weaknesses of published statements. And then our work on migrant labour, in a sense, has an equally long history, but perhaps there has been more specific focus over the past several years. Much of this dates back to before the time at which I joined ETI UK, but Cindy Berman, who was the head of the unit and my manager, had done a lot of work on a project looking at Bangladeshi migrant workers in Mauritius in the textile sector. That is a useful example, I think, because it culminated in early 2018 with a conference bringing together various of our member companies, relevant governments, civil society and unions to try to identify a way forwards. And out of that, in terms of ETI UK's work, developed a migrant labour working group for our membership, which ran for about 2 years. And we've now decided to include that as a thematic topic within our modern slavery working group so that everything is in one place. And we also started a piece of project work on access to remedy for migrant workers, but I'm going to describe that in more detail when I come to talk about our current work. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I wanted to focus on this access to remedy project because this is probably the main piece of work we currently have ongoing, which is dedicated or has a dedicated focus on migrant workers. So it's a 2-year project beginning in April 2019 and running through to March 2021. Excuse me. It's funded by the UK Home Office's Modern Slavery Innovation Fund. And for us, it began with a question that many of our member companies were asking, which was they knew that there were many migrant workers present in their supply chain. They knew that those migrant workers were vulnerable, and they also knew that they often wouldn't or couldn't use available grievance and remedy mechanisms. So the question was, how do you provide access to remedy in a meaningful way to migrant workers? How do you put it in place so that they actually do use it? And that, in a sense, was the, if you like, research question that prompted us to begin this project. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why access to remedy? There are a number of aspects of the migrant worker experience that we could have focused on, but we felt that this was a particularly useful and important way of approaching the issues that they typically faced. And I know many of you will be familiar with these points, but I'll run through them just for clarity. Migrant workers are often heavily indebted when they reach their destination workplace because they've paid substantial recruitment fees to get the job in the first place and to travel there and go through the necessary processes on the way. So they are therefore very reluctant to cause trouble in the workplace, to risk losing their job when they have that burden of debt. In many countries, they also are legally disadvantaged insofar as they have different and lesser legal rights. That might be because of conditions attached to their working visa, restrictions on movement, restrictions on other forms of activity. Consequently, they're in a more vulnerable situation. And because of these vulnerabilities, migrant workers are typically less likely to raise a grievance if they experience exploitation or another issue in the workplace. They're afraid of losing their job. They don't trust existing grievance mechanisms, and there may also be language barriers that mean they're less likely to use whatever mechanisms are in place. And then finally, of course, in many ways, the best solution to that set of problems is to have an active, functioning, representative trade union in the workplace that can support and represent the migrant workers. Sadly, often that just isn't an option for the migrant workers. This project in particular has a focus on Malaysia, where at least in the areas that we're working in, there isn't a very large union presence. And there are also legal restrictions that mean that migrant workers can join a union, but they can't start a union or hold office in one. So their ability to engage with trade unions is significantly limited. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the picture on the right is the front cover of ETI's 2019 access to remedy guidance. So this predates the current project that I'm talking about. And this is an example of ETI's quite comprehensive thematic guidance that we produce on a number of topics. The project, however, is slightly separate. It builds on those principles, but with a more specific focus on migrant workers. So there are two key outputs of the project. The first one is access to remedy principles. This is a policy level set of principles, very short, just a few pages, that tries to set out the key steps, roles and responsibilities, mainly aimed at businesses down their supply chains, but also at other supply chain actors, to describe what needs to be done to establish an access to remedy system that works also for migrant workers. And there are a couple of points that I think are useful to highlight about this. One that I put on here is that it highlights the role of workers, that they need to be consulted in the design of any grievance mechanism. And that's what we're doing in this project, because if not, it's quite likely there'll be a mismatch between their expectations and what they trust and what's put in place. And at a much simpler level, what the principles do is kind of obvious in that they say, remember that migrant workers have rights and should be allotted those rights and treated just like any other worker, even though sadly they often aren't. And it's calling for that special attention to be paid to them because of the vulnerabilities that they often suffer. Next slide, please. And the second output of the project is a pilot technology platform in one specific country context, which is Malaysia. We are working in Malaysia because of the large number of migrant workers in Malaysia, both legally registered and not, and from a number of different national origins. The idea is through this pilot project to show a kind of proof of principle of the access to remedy principles in one project in one place. So we're working with a number of factories who belong to 2 companies in the rubber goods manufacturing sector in Malaysia. And we're working with them to co-design a technology platform that we'll then roll out and implement in the factories and gather evidence on how well it works as a means for migrant workers to access remedy in the workplace. So far, we've completed the baseline research with the workers and management in the participating factories. And over the summer, we hope to be piloting the technology platform itself. We're currently working on developing that right now. We're not developing something from nothing because we didn't have the time or resource to do that, but we're working with a UK company called 58 to adapt their existing technology to this particular context. And one final point to make there, I think, is that we're aware there's a lot of technology in this space. There's a lot of technology aimed at migrant workers, and much of it is very good. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and we also didn't think that technology by itself was the answer to the problem. But we do think that technology suitably designed and implemented, together with appropriate capacity building and training, can be an important way to facilitate social dialogue, build up trust, and provide avenues for grievances to be reported and remedy to be provided. So obviously, given that the project is ongoing and we're currently in Malaysia, there's been a degree of reorientation to deal with COVID-19 issues. The immediate needs of migrant workers in Malaysia right now are not access to remedy, they're access to food and shelter, because those who have lost their jobs don't have access to a great deal of state support. So our local delivery partner there, which is an NGO called Our Journey, is reorientating some of its short-term efforts to provide that emergency support, and we're working to redirect some of our project funds to support that, before hopefully returning on track with the project from around July, depending on when movement restrictions lift and the situation returns to something like normal. But it's been an interesting experience because it clearly showed that we needed to be quite reactive in our project, and the donor, the Home Office, has been very understanding and supportive of that, fortunately. Next slide, please. The other COVID-19 specific activity that we've been doing on migrant workers is producing this briefing note, which we published about 2 weeks ago. This is part of a series of briefing notes that we're publishing in response to COVID-19 supply chain risks. So we've already published one on occupational safety and health, and we'll be publishing future ones on other key topics that we think need addressing, or that the members tell us they want additional guidance on. Each briefing note is very short, 2-3 pages long, and it tries to highlight the key risks and the key actions that businesses can take to address those risks. And they aim to be very practical, even though they're high level and aimed at brands and retailers with a view to what they can do within their supply chain. But it was very clear that migrant workers should be one of the first things to write a briefing note on, because as you'll have seen, the number of news stories around the world about the degree of suffering being experienced by migrant worker populations in many different countries, in many different contexts, both international migrant workers and domestic, has been overwhelming. And I think for a lot of companies, it's a question of what can they meaningfully do over the next few weeks and months to try to mitigate those risks as far as possible, especially in a context where audits can't happen as they normally do. And so the sort of conventional tool that companies are relying on to understand what's happening in their supply chain are either not available at all or just available in a very restricted form. So the actions we've set out in this note try to suggest ways around that, and again, happy to discuss that in more detail. Next slide, please. So that's all I wanted to cover, really. I hope that gives you a flavour of some of the key areas of work we've undertaken on modern slavery and on migrant workers, and a little bit about our current focus. As I said, I know I've kind of gone through that very quickly. I'm very happy to expand on any of those points as is useful for you. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Owain. That was a really interesting talk. I'd like to follow up with a couple of questions directly related to your talk. When you mentioned the Malaysia project, you talked about technology platform, which can be a bit abstract for the listener. Would you mind to explain a bit what that is?
Of course, yeah. So it will be a mobile phone app. And the reason we used the phrase technology platform, I think, earlier in the project was because we didn't want to prejudge whether an app would be appropriate or not, or whether some other kind of implementation would be better, whether that's a website or integration with an existing piece of software. But in the end, what we are doing is adapting an app for smartphones, having talked to the workers and understood that would work well for them.
Great. I was also wondering about, you said ETI had lobbied to include a modern slavery statement in the legislation, that would be useful. Have you seen that? What impact do you think this has had on companies' work with migrant workers? Have you seen that this has actually transformed into practical actions by companies in the UK?
It's a really good question, and I don't know if I have time to do justice to it, but I think over the past 5 years, so we've now had we've now had four. We've had 4 complete annual reporting rounds under the UK legislation. So companies that were required to report from day one have now done so mostly around 4 times. And it's been an interesting experience. I think we have seen a small number of companies demonstrate really excellent practice, some of which I'm glad to say are ETI members. And they've produced quite long, comprehensive modern slavery statements every year, which have been quite open and honest about their risks and what they're doing to address those risks in their supply chain. And they've used the statement as a kind of reporting tool to publicly describe what actions they've taken, what results they've obtained, and what further actions they're planning for the next 12 months. And it's so they're kind of using the statement as a way to publicly hold themselves to account. And that's exactly how we encourage companies to use the statements. And that, insofar as the statements are specific to modern slavery, they're then a tool for how to hold themselves to account for actions to take against modern slavery risk. However, I think our general advice to businesses when it comes to modern slavery is not that it should be treated as a completely separate thing, but more that it is one end of a spectrum of exploitation, a continuous spectrum which has decent work at the other end. So that if they conduct proper human rights due diligence in their supply chains, that's the same approach which is appropriate for modern slavery risk, just as it is for other labour risks. So I would expect to see migrant worker issues in modern slavery statements as well. However, I think in terms of overall corporate performance in modern slavery reporting, it's worth saying that there has been a significant number of companies who have not reported well. And unfortunately, what the UK lacks, or has lacked until now, is a suitable accountability mechanism for those companies who do not report well or who do not report at all. It looks like that may change in future. There are changes to the legislation ongoing, but to date, that's probably been the key weakness.
Great, thanks a lot. We've received some really good questions in our chat. We'll come back to them in the panel. So keep writing your questions in the chat and we'll have a chance to come back to them later. But for now, thanks a lot, Owain, for your presentation.
Thank you.
And we'll go over to Katrine Karlsen, Sustainability Manager at UNIL, a Norwegian food retailer and member of ETI Norway. She'll be talking about empowering migrant workers through training, shared knowledge, and constructive dialogue. Please go ahead with your presentation, Katrine.
Thank you so much, Henrik, and good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I'll do my best to make this engaging and fun in this analog world of webinars. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to share with you today some of our work together with other Nordic retailers and organizations on migrant workers in Thailand specifically. Nina, I can't see the screen, so I'll trust you to have it up, but we were supposed to share a little video.
Hi, yes, I'm waiting to put the video on. So
okay,
do you want me
good.
to put it on now?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah,
so we have a little video of our newly branded initiative, which has gone from being the Nordic initiative to Move. So enjoy.
Okay, let's do that again. So can you all see the movie?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay, let's hope that you will hear sound as well.
Yeah, so together with my colleagues at the other organizations that are currently involved with Move, we're super happy to be able to present some of our work today and hopefully inspire others to join as well. So I just wanted to first give you a little bit of a background about UNIL. It's not the most known brand name on the block, but we are the procurement organization of private labels to Norgesgruppen, which is the largest supermarket and HoReCa actor in Norway. And we have a portfolio of over 4,000 products from over 500 first-tier suppliers in 41 countries. So it goes without saying that we have a tremendous job in ensuring that human rights are respected throughout our supply chain. And we know that we have, as any company with a global supply chains, huge challenges that we need to address specifically. So through our human rights due diligence, we have in a number of these countries and our supply chains identified and prioritized the risk of poor working conditions and forms of forced labor for migrant workers. And we've done this through different initiatives and efforts, but what we see throughout all these countries is that the key to contributing to actual change is collaboration, and we cannot go this road alone. So that's the reason why UNIL joined the Move collaboration back in 2017. So today I'll give a brief introduction of the Move collaboration, what our aim is and what we're trying to achieve, and also give you a little bit of insight to the work we've done in Thailand so far, and also how we are planning to use the platform that we've created to provide some rapid response in light of the COVID crisis in Thailand as well. So just put questions in the chat and I'll answer them a little bit later. So the goal of MOVE is to empower migrant workers in global supply chains. And we wanted to do that, you can jump back a slide, Ina, through easily accessible training, shared knowledge, and constructive dialogue in the workplace. So in my work at ETI Norway, which we'll go back to in a few months' time, for the last 6 years, I've been very much involved in understanding and trying to implement training throughout different supply chains. And a common denominator, I think also that Owain was touched upon, is that you kind of need a toolbox of different approaches to provide different stakeholders within the supply chain, and specifically on site within a factory, or if it's in a processing plant or at plantation level, different means to acquire awareness and knowledge about their rights. So in Thailand, and this particular, through MOVE, we've kind of prioritized to do this through digital training on rights and responsibilities that we adapt in local languages for different markets, and I'll come back to explain how we've done that in Thailand. And the training mainly raises awareness in health and safety, worker engagement, which means then dialogue between workers and management, and also between local or native employees and migrant workers, also looking into wage management and workplace policy, and most importantly, maybe ethical recruitment practices. And the primary target group for the MOVE initiative is migrant workers, but also local employees, to ensure that the interaction between these two worker groups can be as good as possible. And of course, we also provide then the training for middle managers and management in the factory to ensure all the stakeholders have access to the same information when it comes to these issues. And we want to reach migrant workers in all tiers, both on sites, but also pre-departure or at arrival centers. And now with IOM
Sorry,
on board.
Katrine,
Yeah.
should I still be on the first slide?
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Yeah, okay, good, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. And now that we have IOM on board, we are also able to through some of their program, deliver the content that has been developed also at arrival centers. So it's really quite interesting to see how this will pan out in the months to come, but sadly it's all a bit on hold now for obvious reasons. And further, we aim to engage with the recruitment agency as well. We've started the work in Thailand, but the plan is to expand the work into other key production countries as well. So this could, for example, include Sweden to focus on Thai migrant workers picking blueberries, or countries like Turkey, Italy, etc., where we know that migrant workers are at great risk. Next slide, please. So in Thailand, we, as you saw in the movie in 2016, there was a case that concerned indirectly some of the members in the group that came together initially, linked to forced labor, and we found out that, okay, there is a need to do some preventative work to ensure that migrant workers have access to information about their rights and increased knowledge about how to get their rights respected within the workplaces. So over the last 2 decades, Thailand has become a key destination for migrant workers from neighboring countries such as Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, and Vietnam. And as of August last year, according to the Ministry of Labor in Thailand, there was close to 3 million registered migrant workers in Thailand. So they are a vital part of the the workforce in Thailand. They make a substantial contribution to Thailand's economic performance, and as well as their home communities in the sending countries. So there's great opportunity, but at a great cost to many of these workers. As I would imagine most of us on this call today is familiar with some of the key challenges for migrant workers. We see that many of them work under difficult conditions with long working hours, and they face discriminatory practices on the job, such as lower paid than national workers, poor safety. They have limited access to information about safety measures. They're subject to unethical recruitment practices and forms of forced labor. And in Thailand, this applies to many industries such as fish and seafood, poultry, food processing, garments, and electronics. So it's a very, I guess, universal issue, not specific to necessarily one or two sectors. So in Move Thailand, what we look to do is to see how we can promote ethical recruitment practices for migrant workers, and to ensure a higher standard of practice regarding rights and responsibilities, primarily by building knowledge through about current labor laws that's applicable to workers, and also in the ETI base code and international conventions. And also, in order to reach as many as possible, we've kind of gone with the Quizzer solution, which I'll come back to in a minute for this particular pilot, to assure that we can provide efficient training within the factories, and in a hope to improve then conditions at the factories that we've been training at currently with the Sjöö pilots. Next slide, please. We conducted a pilot last year after having developed the content for the training material. So this is delivered on a tablet-based model. So 12 factories in our joint supply chains, some that we share amongst the members that were participating in the pilot. There was 12 factories that joined, and in the pilot, almost 2,500 employees and managers conducted the training, which accumulated to over 10,000 training sessions in the different areas. And in this group of people, there was 1,500 Thai, 540 migrant workers from Myanmar, and over 200 Cambodian migrant workers that trained. So we did reach a significant proportion of migrant workers within the training, as well as local Thai workers. Next slide, please. So when I talk about, oh, can you go back one? Thank you. So this tablet-based training is very much based around gamification, which we've seen work really well in some Asian countries. It's a very engaging way of training. So the training is structured up around short film, what we call live action drama. So it's almost little soap operas about what could happen in a factory environment, where you follow characters that you can relate to, and the little dramas are then followed up by quizzes with multiple choice questions with the right answer. So the training we often conduct in smaller groups, which also enables a more interactive way of discussing the different topics that are being shown in the videos, and working together to get to the correct answer. And in this particular pilot, we were limited to the food sector. However, the training is developed to fit different industries and tiers. And in the pilot, we developed the training content in Khmer, Thai, and Burmese to ensure that the key migrant groups could get training in their own language. And there's also a voiceover. So if there's a issue of literacy, that should not be a barrier to access the training. And yeah, next slide, please. So as a result of the pilot, which again we did in 12 factories, so yeah, it's a limited evaluation, but what we see is that workers do have an increased knowledge about their rights and responsibilities. So we did a baseline prior to the training, and we saw that conducting the end line, there was a 10% increase overall in increased knowledge. So that's a promising result, showing that this type of training can complement a wider strategy to improve the conditions for migrant workers, especially. And the workers reported back that they think this way of training is interactive, it's fun, it's a bit different and new, and the gamification part of it they really enjoy and find quite fun. And yeah, the little dramas are quite funny, which creates a lot of laughter as well around the table, while at the same time delivering important information. And for the supplier side, which is for us as a retailer, kind of the way we can reach workers through, by doing a tool like this, they also feel like they have ownership and understanding of the information that is being delivered to their workers. So they feel quite safe and positive about contributing to increased knowledge amongst their workforce. And they also find it to be quite a time-effective way of training. And for us as a retailer, another component of this training is that we in a portal have access to kind of live data on how many workers that have been trained at the different factories and how they perform in the different areas, which enables us to go in and speak to our supplier about which areas that there might be a need for further capacity building on as well. And when it comes to, next slide please, the current COVID-19 situation, we have identified that there is a need for access to information and awareness on rights amongst migrant workers. So we are now in the MOVE initiative looking to initiate some activities to respond to this particular issue. So we're looking at the possibility of doing a smartphone adaptation of the full program that's been developed within the TAB solution, and also to add some COVID-19 animations for workers across all supply chains and all tier, in focusing on recruitment processes and ensuring that the workers have access to information about guidelines about protecting themselves from the virus, and also what's happening in terms of border restriction as well. And the second thing we're looking at doing is to set up a rapid action hub, potentially a website with COVID-19 related information and digital training and occupational health and safety on a kind of open source page that can be spread through social media and established local channels and forums, and also enabling our suppliers to stay up to date on the latest development to ensure that they can provide the best support for their migrant workforce. So moving forward, next slide please. MOVE is currently looking for more businesses and organizations to join, and we're currently in the process of defining the scope and the next activities for MOVE. So looking at different countries where there could be opportunities to do something similar as to what we've done in Thailand, and also in Thailand focusing on when the COVID-19 crisis kind of settles a bit what further activities we will do to further support migrant workers within our supply chains there. So anyone that would like more information about the MOVE project, contact Vivica or myself or Henrik, and we will gladly tell you more about it in more detail. 10 minutes or 15 goes by pretty quick, so I'm sorry that I rushed through. I hope you got something out of it. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Katrine. That was really interesting. I'll just follow up with a quick question. I've been working myself with trainings for workers in factories, and it's a bit of a never-ending job because many factories have a high worker turnover. So you need to repeat this again and again. And of course, this will be the case, very much the case, with migrant workers. So how are you working with this? Is it part of the project that this will be owned by the factory and integrated in their recruitment to have it ongoing?
Yeah, sorry, I should have been a bit clear about that. So then you're completely right. So with this tool, this tablet, the suppliers are able to keep it as part of their overall training program for new employees or as a refresher training. So it's always available at the factory. So if, as a worker, I would like to refresh my knowledge on, say, workplace policy, that's available to me as well. So it is an efficient way, and I don't like to use the way efficient because training should be of a quality to ensure that workers get the information they need, but it just contributes in that overall toolbox of a supplier to enable and ensure that new and existing workers get the training that they need. So yeah, it definitely has that element into it.
Great, thanks a lot, Katrine. And now we'll pass the torch to Per-Olof Sjöö, President of the Swedish Union for Forestry, Wood and Graphical Workers, as well as President for the Building and Woodworkers International, who's going to talk about the union response to supporting migrant workers in time of crisis. Please go ahead, Per-Olof.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join this seminar today. I have no presentation here, so you would have to cope with my voice, I'm afraid. But just a small background to the Building and Woodworkers International. It's a global trade union federation which gathers around 350 trade unions around the world. We are present in 127 countries, and as we organize workers within construction, wood and forestry, of course the migrant workers issues are really important to us. It's a really high density of migrant workers within these sectors. I would like to just start to give some global perspective on this issue, and I will also put it down, give some insight into the Swedish situation, and at the end I will try to think a little bit about the future and recommendations for the future. But first of all, I think it's important to say that migrant workers are disproportionately found in precarious and insecure work. Many migrant workers are excluded from medical services or afraid to seek them. However, migrant workers are needed if we are to cope with the coronavirus situation. Many of them are working in healthcare and other vital society services, and they may be affected by lockdowns and other measures and their living environments. If care and conditions are not adequate, it may expose them to the virus. Let me just give a few examples of the challenges that we think the workers are facing right now. If we first look at the Gulf area, where construction and many other services are dependent on migrant workers, many thousands of workers right now are housed in confined conditions. BWI has visited many accommodations in Qatar in recent years, and even the best facilities are densely populated and due to the heat closed. It's the same principle as with the better known examples of cruise ships where the virus can spread among a confined group of people. And in some lockdown situations, problems may develop of access to food, clean water, sanitations, and other facilities. And in countries like India, we have all read about that national lockdown has caused economic disruption across the country and left millions of migrant workers who rely on daily wages to survive stranded with no money. And many of them are desperate to return to their home states from big cities. They have been walking hundreds of kilometers or hitching rides on goods lorries rather than waiting for the special bus and train services that has been organized by the government. And in Europe, migrant workers face an unenviable choice. Stay at work, often on the social care frontline, and potentially risk infection, or return to their home country, jobless and stigmatized. Many people from Europe's poorest regions who took advantage of freedom of movement are now caught in a no man's land. With border closures, no repatriation flights, if they lost their low-paid jobs, they have few savings, and limited or no access to a state safety net. If they do manage to return home, some face the suspicion that they might have brought the virus with them. We don't know whether the mass return of the Eastern European population to the homelands is temporary or for good. It's hard to tell. With poorer medical and social welfare systems, Eastern European countries are likely to suffer severe economic and social crisis. And with the opening of borders in Schengen zone, the trade unions are concerned about the risk of exposure to COVID-19 on job sites and in accommodations and a possible second wave of the virus. They argue that there are not yet strong, effective health and safety protections for construction migrant workers. How has then the trade unions dealt with this problematic situation? Well, in many countries, since the start of this health crisis, unions has maintained close contacts with its members, including migrant workers, who decided to stay in countries of destination before the borders closed. They have provided full support to migrant workers by helping them secure their jobs and incomes and informing them of their rights when traveling abroad or in case of sickness or quarantine. Special attention has also been given to laid off workers. But also in some countries around the globe, BWI affiliate has had to transform their normal trade union work into more humanitarian work, as where we have to deliver food packages to migrant workers or distribution of masks and sanitizers. So it's a huge challenge for trade unions all over the world to deal with this situation right now. And of course, it's a very problematic situation for millions of migrant workers who are right now facing big problems. If we look at the Swedish situation, of course, it's quite similar to the rest of the Europe. The travel ban due to COVID-19 has put some sectors with a high density of migrant workers in a problematic situation. It's an ongoing discussion here right now about the necessity of migrant workers when the domestic unemployment rates now is fastly approaching 10%. I think it's a big discussion, and I think it will go on for quite a long time as we see these COVID-19 restrictions. In the forestry sector, who is also a big part of the migrant workers in Sweden, we have struggled with this issue for 20 years. And the Swedish system for migration from third countries is one of the most liberal in the world. When you apply for a work permit, you need to have an offer of employment that meet the standards in the applicable collective agreements. However, we have seen several cases where employers in fact pays less than the offered conditions. In some cases, we in my union, we have taken the decision to pay for legal counseling, although the workers are not members of our union. And I heard this morning that our colleagues in the construction union in Sweden has presented a report where they have found a similar situation for migrant workers in the construction sector. So I think this is a more of a general problem also in Sweden when it comes to safeguarding the conditions of the migrant workers. And I have to say that we are clearly struggling with the challenge to organize migrant workers. Most of the workers are here for a limited time period, and they have little knowledge of the right to organize or for the rights that follows with the collective agreements. So how will this develop now, the situation? It's hard to tell, I think, what long-term impact the present COVID-19 restrictions have on the movement of labor. We have seen some corporate comments on the vulnerability of global supply chains, and of course also on the shortage of workforce when migrants aren't available. Will this have an impact on how the global labor market will be organized in the future? Or is it just a bump on the road when it comes to the drive for globalization? I think no one can tell today, as we are still in an emerging situation when it comes to dealing with the situation. But I think this will be an interesting discussion for the future. What recommendations? I mean, we work a lot with migrant workers all over the world, and I think I would like to highlight two recommendations for companies that is working with migrant workers daily. And I think one of the most important recommendation is that it's imperative that we establish a constructive social dialogue with the relevant trade unions when it comes to conditions for migrant workers. This is a dialogue that needs to be formal, and it needs to be based on the situation on the ground for the migrant workers. We have different systems in the world when it comes to labor market regulations, but I think the most sustainable way of dealing with this is actually to have this social dialogue on a formal basis. And the second one is that companies need to be very clear, crystal clear with the employees on the active support for their right to organize, and encourage the workers to contact their unions. There is a very big lack of knowledge about fundamental workers' rights, and I think that the companies can be a good enforcer and contributor into have a sustainable working life also for migrants. That is my two recommendations, and I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot. It's really interesting. I've also followed the work that the BWI has done in Qatar, which I think is really interesting, where we've had a situation with guest workers working in this construction of the 2022 World Cup football under really appalling conditions. And I think the building and woodworkers have managed to get a deal with Qatar there in order to secure working or help to improve working conditions on the ground for the migrant workers, even though Qatar as a country has very strict anti-union laws. I think that's quite an achievement. Could you explain a bit how this has come about and the results of this work with migrant workers in Qatar?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's an achievement given the situation in Qatar, but I would like to emphasize that there is a lot of work to be done still in Qatar. But it's a lot of ingredients when it comes to the work in Qatar that has been helping us in the work to improve the situations for the migrant workers there. Firstly, of course, it's when you arrange a big sports event like the World Cup, you have the public eye. It's easier to highlight the situation for the workers when you have that global event coming up. So that has helped us putting the spotlight on the conditions for the workers there. And actually that's a concept that we have been working with not only in Qatar, we did it previously also in South Africa and Brazil with good results. So that is one of the trade union strategies that we have, that we link the conditions to big sports events. And of course, in Qatar, we also had some pressure on FIFA, who is the organizer of the World Cup. So that, I think, is few of the reasons why we could pull through this memorandum of understanding with the Qatarian authorities, which has been a really good first foot into the Qatari system.
Great, thanks a lot. We might come back to that in our panel discussions. So I think we'll invite all the speakers back into the virtual room. I can see Owain is back here and Katrine. So we'll be taking questions from the audience, and also I'd like to ask a couple of questions. I'll start off with what might be a bit of an odd question, but right now, before starting to work with ETI, I'm actually the sustainability manager at Sandqvist, the Swedish fashion brand. And compared to the migrant workers of the world, of course, we are not suffering as badly, but the fact is that at our company, 20% of the staff has been let go. We're all working part-time in order to get through this crisis. I'm not able to pass any invoice to my boss without having a really good argument for this. So I can imagine a lot of the people listening, working in companies are facing the same issue, that we're really at a time where our main tools will be the time we can put in, what we can do on the internet and our phone. So given this situation, do you have any recommendations? What can we do now if we have just come to realize that migrant workers in our supply chain is a risk that we need to manage, given this precarious situation we're in? And this is a question to all of you, or anyone who feels like they want to answer.
Perhaps I could start, Henrik?
Yeah, please.
So I think it's a really good question, and definitely it's come up a lot in our conversations with members and other companies over the last couple of months. I think the first thing to say is that it's always possible to increase understanding of the risks, and that should always be the first step. And it's probably the one that is less of a financial cost, in that you can always talk to your supplier, you can always reach out to a local trade union or NGO, or if you're a member of an ETI-like body, then you may be able to access that information through them. And even beyond that, I mean, one of the things that migrant workers need, it's certainly not everything, but one thing is information. They may need information about healthcare rights and where they can access support, whether that's from the state or otherwise, and you may be able to provide that. And then a final thing, some companies I know have been looking at their suppliers and assessing which ones are in greatest financial need right now, and trying to prioritize their payment schedule to support suppliers that are in the most vulnerable position, so as to enable the workers at those sites to continue to keep their jobs. It may not be practical for every company, but I think it's an interesting example of best practice.
Great. Some really good hands-on suggestions there.
Yeah, and I think I would support that. As at UNIL, we've been very kind of from when we saw this starting to become a global pandemic, we were pretty quick to establish a dialogue with our suppliers to get information, so we had a better understanding of which countries and what types of risk related to migrant workers and where the most vulnerable migrant workers would be, to be able to prioritize our efforts. And also for UNIL, we're engaged in quite a few projects, and in those projects with other partners, we have also, shifted the focus from the planned project activities to look at how we can provide useful information or support in any way possible. And I think for the food sector, what we've seen, especially for us in Thailand, is that there is an increase in order. Everyone is scrambling to get canned corn, or be it whatever food product needed. So for us, there's actually been an increased risk for overtime. So we've been very transparent and clear with our suppliers that they need to inform us of any increased costs related to labor, and to ensure that they stay within the remits of the code of conduct and national legislation, to ensure that workers, and especially migrant workers, are compensated and provided enough rest as well. So I think dialogue is a good starting point to understand how to move forward.
That's some really good points there.
Just to add there, I agree with what has been said, but I think also when you are in this emerging situation where the day-to-day situation can change very rapidly, I think that's also an argument for actually keeping the dialogue ongoing. And one other thing might be that you can never underestimate the importance of health and safety issues, especially at these times.
Good. I think that the part about health and safety brings me to one of the questions from our viewers, who was interested to hear about alternatives to auditing at these times, because auditing is one of the effective tools to actually monitor health and safety. And I think Owain, you mentioned alternatives to auditing as a discussion at ETI UK. Can you share with us what you've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing to say is we will be publishing a briefing note on due diligence during the crisis, I think, in the near term, which my colleague Bev Hall will be leading on. So I don't want to preempt that too much, but one thing that we mentioned in the migrant worker briefing note was using local trade unions and local NGOs. We use the phrase information safety net. So to understand basic risks and how they intersect with your supply chain. And I think that's now more important than ever. So in Malaysia, we found that our NGO, we were very lucky, we had this NGO we were partnered with, and they are very well connected to the migrant worker community, both civil society and worker groups, and were able to give us and to give our members really comprehensive updates on the changing situation on the ground, which is changing so quickly that without their local knowledge, it would be very hard to keep track of what's happening. So I would really recommend that wherever possible, a good first step is to reach out to those local partners.
That's very good. Katrine, you have any thoughts on how is UNIL working in these times?
Yeah, well, for UNIL, like it's for everyone working with audits. We all it's all been stopped, and I think it's worth also being cautious that in these times, if there's put too much pressure on suppliers to carry out audits or inspections, I think we have established that there's increased risk for corruption and fraud as well, because some of our suppliers are under great pressure. So we have given a bit of leeway for the current time being to our suppliers, and we support them in kind of rescheduling and planning new audits and other types of follow-up to times where they actually have the capacity to do so. So we try to be very cooperative, but at the same time, we're very specific towards our suppliers, saying that we wish to support you to ensure that ethical and environmental or social and environmental standards are upheld, if not improved on certain areas in this period. So very much trying to be, I guess, the best partner we can be for our suppliers in these times as well. And also to look at different initiatives and projects that we are engaged in, or that could be valuable for our suppliers to engage with locally, if it's local trade unions that have initiated great programs or initiatives, or IOM, to ensure that they're engaged on the critical issues as well. And then I just wanted to say that ETI Norway, that we're a member of, has also been very helpful. And for the migrant situation, they've developed a resource, very simple Excel spreadsheet, helping members to identify which countries that migrant workers are at most risk and what you should be looking for, and also supporting in connecting with local organizations on the ground. So that's been very helpful for our part as well.
Thanks. Per-Olof, you mentioned constructive social dialogue as being one of the more important tools, and that companies, first of all, need to acknowledge freedom of association and be very clear about this down their supply chain. And Owain came back to the point of reaching out to local trade unions as one part of knowing how the situation is on the ground in these times. But how has the work of the local trade unions been affected by the COVID pandemic? Do they have the same possibility to monitor and keep track of the situation?
Yeah, I think every trade union, no matter where you are in the world now, is right now struggling with the challenge to actually reach out to our members, and it's problematic that we are now. It's hard to visit the workplaces, and you have to find other ways to have dialogue with the members. So it's clearly also a challenge for us in the trade unions. I would just like to add on. I mean, we have been working with a lot of multinational companies who has very good standards when it comes to workers' rights. But it's so natural, especially if you come from the Nordic countries, that you think that it's automatically implemented within the workers. That's a lot of people around the world come from a completely different position, where fundamental workers' rights are not given at all. So that's why I think that it's really important that you actually emphasize to the workers their basic rights. That it doesn't come automatically.
So not only to your supplier, but also all the way down to the factory floor, emphasize the freedom of association.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's time to let more questions come in from the audience. Nina, do you have any questions that you've seen in the chat that you'd like to raise with the panelists?
Yes, we have a couple of questions that I think we haven't really touched upon yet. Let me see. We have a question here, which is mostly to Owain. Can we even source during this legal situation? This is from Christina, and she says, in Malaysia, there are regulations against migrant workers that contradicts human rights. For example, women migrant workers are not allowed to be pregnant. And how do you recommend companies to act in these situations? And can we even source during this legal situation if we cannot see a chance to change legislation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think that's a question that comes up in several different contexts. I think there are probably a couple of different answers to it. One would be, you know, typically we're working with businesses who do source from these places. That's how we become involved. For those businesses, if they decide to stop sourcing from that context, that's probably going to make the situation worse for the workers concerned, particularly because the businesses who are talking to us are likely to be the better businesses, or those more interested in improving conditions for workers. And we would rarely advocate a solution which seems to make it likely that workers are going to lose their job, because clearly that's not a good outcome. The second answer, and this I think comes up in the Malaysia context, is a more pragmatic one. So the rubber goods companies we're working with in Malaysia are producing things like surgical rubber gloves, which right now are in huge global demand. So pragmatically, there's no way that countries and companies are not going to source from these factories. So I would rather look at it as, given that's the situation, how can we try to make sure that the conditions for workers are as good as they possibly can be?
Thank you. Can I add one more question?
Sure.
We have an interesting question to Per-Olof here. How to deal with places in the world or sectors with fake unions or yellow unions, or even no unions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we struggle with that every day. For us in BWI, it's really important that it's the workers' voice that are echoed through the unions. And we know around the world that there are sometimes other interests that also is a part of the trade unions. But we actually work really hard with going to the workplaces, building capacity from the ground to guarantee that the trade unions actually are free and independent, and that there are no other interests than the workers' voice that are represented within the unions. But it's a hard fight.
Thank you.
I saw another question here regarding there's been some talks about 2 different technological platforms being used, and there was a question, are these publicly available? Might be interesting to use these types of materials. Maybe someone, if companies wants to adapt these to their situations, or yeah. How are these shared? Do you need to join the projects, or will they be available to be adapted?
I guess I can speak a bit for the work in Move, and I know Sophie Nordström is on the call as well from Quizzer. But in Move, the pilot work that we've done, it's a kind of cost-sharing model between brands and suppliers, and that's the setup for the Quizzer solution in general, but they've also made available some occupational health and safety training, which they've opened up and made publicly available in these times. But I think there is absolutely potential to look at how to link up some of these tech initiatives, while at the same time ensuring that it doesn't become too general, but also accommodate the local needs and the infrastructure. So for example, you know, having worked a bit in different countries, in some countries workers have better access to smartphones or mobile data, and they have that covered, or their access to Wi-Fi, while in other countries that's not necessarily available to them. So you have to choose another tech solution to ensure that they get access to the training. So I think it's important to look at how, you know, forces can be joined, but at the same time ensuring that the workers access the training in an appropriate manner, specific to their context.
Thanks. I can see a lot of questions in the chat box, and from the panelists, I understand you could talk for another hour about this. Unfortunately, we've set the end time to 10:30, so I'll pass over the word to Viveka for some concluding remarks, and also a big thank you to everyone in the panel for these great talks and the discussion. Thank you. Viveka, are you still here?
I'm here. Thank you so much, Henrik. Thank you, Owain and Per-Olof and Katrine and Nina, for all your help. And thank you all participants for joining today. I'd like just to conclude with showing this slide with different resources and links to where you can find information and guidance on the topic of migrant workers during pandemic times and how to support. If you would like to stay on 15 minutes, you will have the chance to get your questions answered, which are still remaining in the chat. If not, I'd like to say thank you and goodbye to those of you who cannot stay on. If you are interested to know more about ETI Sweden, become a member, or know more about Move, or any other things that we talked about today, don't hesitate to contact us. So thank you, and that's it for this event. Now to the mingle. I think that people can unmute themselves now if you'd like to have a more like almost natural conversation maybe. And maybe I could start by asking the panelists about, or actually asking everyone participating. The question is from Azalia at IKEA. If there's anyone who has experience of working with their suppliers to prevent the spread of coronavirus. Now it's a bit of a sound issue here, so that's why I'm hesitating. But the question is, there's increasing media reports on the terrible situations many migrant workers are in at this time, and the importance of paying attention even more to vulnerabilities at this time. I would like to know if there are any cases that someone here might be working with where taking precautions in the workplace or accommodation work in terms of safeguarding worker health, preventing COVID-19 outbreak, or being able to quickly contain the spread if there was an outbreak. Anyone? Everyone, unfortunately, so we cannot have a natural conversation. But Katrine,
I have muted everyone because I thought it was a little bit too loud. So please, all of you who are still here, I think you can unmute yourself, and if not, you'll have to use the raise hand function or something similar. It was a little bit too noisy to have all of you unmuted, unfortunately.
Yeah. But what we can say, Katrine, is that as you mentioned in the MOVE initiative, we plan to include an animation film from WHO on how to protect yourself. And that will be open source if the plans go well. So that is touching upon the answer to that question.
May I add? This is Sophie from Quizzer.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. I think I can also, there are some examples of how we can make the training open source. I sent the link where we have something we did with ILO Better Work in Bangladesh to sort of add COVID-19 related information with also information on occupational health and safety for workers. So you can have a look there if you want to. Just
Great.
as an example of what MOVE wants to do.
Thank you.
Nina, do we have any more questions in the chat?
Let me see. I think we have covered most of them. Henrik, do you see anything that we haven't really touched upon yet?
I think there's a practical question with guidance for factories on taking precautions in the workplace. So very hands-on practical guidance for safety, an additional health and safety module on now that we're facing this pandemic. And is there something you have seen out there? I know from my own example that we have at our supplier level in India, there's they come back to work and there are guidelines on how to work, how many can work in the factory, what safety equipment to use, and rules around social distancing and so on. But I don't know if there is some collection of this advice for countries per country that is collected out there to be shared. If anyone knows, feel free to share.
I think from us being in food, there's quite a lot of hygiene measurements in terms of quality to begin with. So our experience, in some cases, it might not be for all our suppliers, but the ones that have been fairly proactive in their communication have demonstrated very specific guidelines that they've developed in accordance to national guidelines for that specific country. So I guess in some cases, if you have a portfolio of suppliers from various countries where you maybe see that some suppliers from country A are not coming through with a lot of information on specific measurements, it could be that there's certain things you can pick up of good practice examples from other suppliers that can be shared, trying to kind of spread that good practice within your own supply chain. And one thing we've also seen been very useful in a time where travel is very much restricted and it's difficult to verify is also to ask suppliers to either film or take photographs of the different procedures they put into place, just to get more of a visual of the different workplaces, because I know with a sharp eye you might be able to pick up, you know, a thing or two as well. So just trying to find different ways than only email and text to get a picture of what it's looking like for some part of the supply chains where that's possible.
I'd also add to that you know, there are pockets of really good practice, and if you're able to identify those, then there may be opportunities for peer learning or for extracting lessons that can then be shared with other factories or workplaces. For general sort of resources and quite high level advice, I'd point you to the ETI UK Occupational Safety and Health Briefing Note, which is available on our website, specific to COVID-19. And we're likely to be doing more specific work within Bangladesh on that in the apparel industry over the next few months, but that hasn't got going just yet.
Can I just add also that we are trying now, if you go to the BWI homepage, bwint.org, we gather regional examples on how different parts of the world deal with it. We call it the COVID response report. There are quite some good examples on how you can deal with this issue on a workplace level.
Thanks, good suggestions.
Per-Olof, you described before your two main suggestions for companies. Would it be possible for Katrine and Owain to give some top suggestions on how to work with migrant workers in this time of pandemic?
I think from a retail perspective, with a fairly large supply chain and one person to try to cover it all, you have to, I think, first of all, gain information to understand where the risks might be heightened for especially vulnerable groups, and you might have to make some priorities. And I think that's just important to just take in, that you won't be able to cover everything at once. So kind of make a list of countries that you prioritize efforts in and get an overview over based on input from trade unions, civil society, and multi-stakeholder initiatives. And then kind of systematically through collaborative efforts and available programs or initiatives on the ground, try to get involved in that. Because we see that it's specifically in Italy, tomatoes is a known commodity with a lot of risk for migrant workers. And we know that going it alone with our suppliers is not the way forward. So trying to engage with the ETI working group on food and farming on tomatoes and local stakeholders is kind of a strategy. So trying to find some strategies that you can work with within specific countries and take it bit by bit. Because I sometimes feel like I'm sitting there with a huge elephant in front of me, and it's sometimes a bit challenging to know where to start. So I think that's important, just to for anyone in this type of position with limited time and resources, just try to know that you're doing a good job and you have to prioritize, because it can be a little bit overwhelming wanting to do as much for as many as possible, the best you can. So
Thanks.
So I think I would probably just reiterate points that Per-Olof and Katrine have already made. There needs to be dialogue. That's probably the number one thing to understand what the risks are and also what can be done to mitigate them. Dialogue with your suppliers, dialogue with unions and NGOs, dialogue with your peer companies, especially where you may share suppliers or supplying areas and you may be able to act collaboratively. And then exactly as Katrine says, I think just prioritization. It's not normally possible, especially if you have a huge supply chain, to address everything simultaneously, and particularly not right now. So I think it's just about being open and honest about that process of prioritizing and just trying to choose the particular issues that you want to try to focus on. And hopefully migrant workers would be one of those issues in particular contexts, given the vulnerabilities that we've been discussing.
And I think if I can add a point, I think it's also pretty critical to get the air or the full attention, preferably of top management in the situation, because they are looking at risk currently to the business very much, and to get in there or to have someone like in UNIL, for example, it's my manager, who's head of quality and sustainability, that is constantly taking information from me up to the leadership group to highlight the risks in our supply chain for human rights, and especially in these times, to ensure that that's a big part of that total understanding of risk as well. I think it's important to be able to then hopefully get resources or time to manage it.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point, and particularly COVID-19 has sort of brought everyone's attention onto the very short term, and for several industries it's about survival, which is understandable, but equally short-term approaches to the workers in your supply chain may mean that supply chain isn't there when you want to regrow and return to normal business after the crisis. So one of the messages that we're repeating a lot is about resilience, and doing the right thing now is important if you want to be still viable in 6 months or a year's time. It's not about short-term trade-off necessarily.
Well, thank you. I think that will be the final word for today. Still, there are more than 30 people on board, but I think it's time now to wrap up. And as a final word, I just would like to say that even though it's very important to focus on global supply chains, we also have a domestic market. We have migrant workers at home. And let's not forget about them. We have cleaners, and we have blueberry pickers, and we have transporters, drivers, workers in the agricultural sector that are also vulnerable, migrant workers. So we should also remember those people and be sure that we have ethical operations and policies in place for them. By that, I'd like to say a million thanks to all of you who participated today, and I wish you a great day and a nice long weekend to come in a few days. So thank you, and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.